The scariest possibility in the universe is not that we're alone, it's that nobody like us lasts. We usually think intelligence is a good thing, something that helps a species survive, adapt, and build. And on Earth, that seems true. Intelligence gave us fire, tools, language, medicine, cities, science. It let us climb out of caves, split the atom, map the genome, and naturally use the internet mainly to argue with strangers. So naturally, we tend to treat intelligence as the upgrade, the thing that gives a species a future. But what if that's wrong? Because when we look out at the universe, we run into a very strange problem. The cosmos is absurdly old, absurdly vast, and full of stars much older than our own. By now, if intelligent life were both common and stable, you'd expect somebody to have got there first. Not necessarily here, but somewhere. You'd expect signs, a signal, a probe, some evidence that once intelligence appears, it tends to stick around. And yet, as far as we can tell, the universe is quiet. Suspiciously quiet. That is the basic problem behind the Fermi paradox. In a universe this large and this old, where is everybody? Now there are lots of possible answers. Maybe intelligent life is incredibly rare. Maybe we're early. Maybe everyone's hiding. Maybe we're looking in completely the wrong place, which would be on brand for us. But there is one answer that keeps bothering people for a reason. Maybe the problem isn't that life never appears. Maybe the problem is that it doesn't get very far, and that is where the idea of the great filter comes in. The great filter is the possibility that somewhere between dead matter and a civilization capable of spreading into space, there is a stage so difficult or so dangerous that almost nobody gets through it. And once you hear that idea, one question immediately follows. Is the filter behind us or ahead of us? Because those are two very different universes. If it's behind us, then something about our existence is much rarer than we tend to assume. Maybe life itself is incredibly unlikely. Maybe simple life is common, but complex life almost never happens. Maybe intelligence is the strange bit. Maybe building a technological civilization is the real miracle. In that version of reality, the universe is quiet because almost nothing gets started, which is lonely, but to be honest, still slightly reassuring. Because if the filter is behind us, then however improbable our existence may be, the hardest part is over. We're the beneficiaries of a ridiculous winning streak stretching back billions of years. The other option is darker. If the filter is ahead of us, then life and intelligence may not be especially rare at all. Civilizations may appear fairly often. They may build tools, discover science, reshape their environment, maybe even start feeling quietly pleased with themselves. And then something happens. Not necessarily one dramatic disaster, not one giant red button marked civilization ends here. A pattern? That is the really unsettling possibility. Because if the filter is ahead of us, then the silence of the universe stops looking like an accident and starts looking more like evidence. Not proof. Nothing that tidy. But evidence in the sense that an empty motorway at 3 a.m. makes you wonder if you've missed a sign. So what kind of pattern are we talking about? Well, here's the weird bit. A species can become powerful very quickly. Wise? Maybe not so quickly. Intelligence solves problems. Yes. But it does not automatically solve the problems intelligence creates. It can give a civilization energy, medicine, engineering, networks, automation, weapons, and systems of extraordinary complexity. What it does not automatically provide is restraint, or coordination, or emotional maturity, or a reliable way to stop clever people doing catastrophically stupid things at scale. And that may be the issue. Maybe civilizations don't fail because they're uniquely evil. Maybe they fail because solving technical problems is one thing, and solving fear, conflict, ego, tribalism, and short-term thinking is something else entirely. For most of a species' history, the big challenge is surviving nature. Then, at a certain point, the big challenge becomes surviving itself. That shift matters. Because once a civilization becomes capable enough, it no longer needs an asteroid, a supervolcano, or a hostile universe to be in danger. It can manufacture its own danger quite efficiently, thank you very much. Its weapons, its rivalries, its incentives, its inability to agree on obvious long-term problems, its habit of building systems first and asking whether they're stable afterwards. And the worrying part is that you don't need every civilization to fail in exactly the same way. You just need most of them to run into the same general problem. Their power grows faster than their judgment. That may be the great filter. Not one event, a gap. The gap between capability and wisdom. And once you look at it like that, the idea starts to feel less like abstract sci-fi and more like an uncomfortable description of modern life. Because you can already see versions of this pattern all around us. We build tools faster than we build rules for using them. We create systems we barely understand and then make ourselves dependent on them. We know certain risks are serious, but keep drifting toward them because competition, politics, convenience, and short-term incentives keep pushing in that direction. Which is another way of saying, intelligence helps you recognize a problem. It does not guarantee that you will behave sensibly about it. A civilization does not need to be stupid to fail. In fact, it may fail precisely because it is smart enough to create powerful systems, but not stable enough to manage the consequences. And that's a very different picture from the usual disaster movie version. The danger may not be one big explosion. It may be a species gradually building a world that becomes harder to control, harder to coordinate, and harder to keep stable. More power, more interconnection, more leverage, more points of failure, until eventually the entire thing starts to depend on levels of judgment, restraint, and cooperation that the species simply does not possess consistently enough. And if that happens often, then the silence of the universe starts to make a grim kind of sense. Not because nobody wakes up, but because waking up may be the easy part. Now, before this becomes completely cheerful, there is another possibility. Maybe the filter really is behind us. And to be fair, Earth gives us some reason to think that. Because when you look back at the history of life here, progress was not exactly brisk. For most of Earth's history, life was simple, very simple. Single-celled organisms dominated for billions of years. Complex life took ages, intelligence took longer. Technological civilization, the kind that invents radio telescopes and existential dread, arrived right at the end. So maybe one of those steps is incredibly rare. Maybe life begins fairly often, but complex cells are the bottleneck. Maybe planets full of microbes are common, while planets with minds, tools, and engineering are spectacularly unusual. If that's true, then the silence of the universe may just be the silence of rarity. Which is strange, but not necessarily threatening. So which of these is worse? A universe where intelligent life is incredibly rare, or one where it appears often enough, but usually doesn't last? At first glance, the first option sounds better. If the filter is behind us, then we're absurdly lucky, but at least the worst part is over. The second option is harder to sit with, because if the filter is ahead of us, then intelligence stops looking like the solution and starts looking more like a test. Not a test of cleverness. We've already got that part. A test of whether a species can survive the phase where its tools become more powerful than its judgment. And that may be the real thing the universe is selecting for. Not intelligence on its own, not invention on its own, not technological brilliance on its own, but whether a civilization can become powerful without becoming fatally unstable. Because maybe that is the real bottleneck, not waking up, growing up. Maybe that is the real test, not whether a species can become intelligent, not whether it can build cities, split atoms, map genes, or send machines into space, but whether it can survive the period in which its power starts to outrun its judgment. Because that may be the stage where everything hangs in the balance. A species reaches the point where it can reshape its environment, redesign life, automate decisions, weaponize information, and build systems so powerful and so complex that the consequences become harder and harder to predict. And at that point, intelligence alone is no longer enough. In fact, intelligence may be the reason the danger exists in the first place. Because intelligence gives a species reach. It gives it leverage. It gives it the ability to solve problems on a scale nature never could. But it also gives it the ability to create new problems on exactly the same scale. That's the part we often skip past. We talk as if intelligence naturally leads to progress, as if becoming more capable somehow guarantees becoming more stable, more mature, more united, more sensible. But why should that be true? Why should a species that becomes clever enough to transform its world automatically become wise enough to survive doing so? Maybe that assumption is the mistake. Maybe intelligence is not the end of the story. Maybe it is a bottleneck, a dangerous phase, a narrow stretch in which a civilization acquires enormous power while still being shaped by older instincts it has not outgrown. Fear, competition, tribalism, short-termism, ego. The urge to win now and worry later. And if enough civilizations reach that stage without getting through it, then the silence of the universe starts to make a grim kind of sense. Not because nobody wakes up, but because waking up may be the easy part. Staying sane, coordinated, restrained, and stable after that may be the real challenge. And that may be the tragedy of intelligent life. Not that it fails to appear, but that it appears often enough to hope, often enough to build, often enough to believe it has a future, and still may not last. Maybe the great filter is behind us. Maybe we are the result of a chain of absurdly unlikely successes, and the universe is mostly silent because almost nothing else gets this far. But if it isn't behind us, if the hardest part begins only after a species becomes powerful enough to change everything, then the quiet of the cosmos may mean something much darker. It may mean that intelligence is common enough to arise, and fragile enough to fail. So perhaps the most unsettling question is not, are we alone? It's this. What if the universe is full of civilizations that reach the same point we have, and that was as far as they ever got?